Hey guys, welcome back. This is our Independence Movements World History 2 SOL14 lecture. Let's take a look. So, after World War II, there were dramatic political changes that took place across the world. Remember, I talked in a previous lecture about decolonization. And some countries we see gain independence after World War One, but it's not really until after World War II that we really see the process of decolonization accelerate. A lot of countries are questioning that practice. Many leaders of powerful countries are arguing that no country should control another nation. Um, think about this too. What's going on in, say between 1945 and 1991? The Cold War, right? Why would the United States and the Soviet Union um, uh, embrace decolonization? What are they hoping for? They're pushing decolonization because they want to expand their spheres of influence. So if the United States is encouraging, the independence of countries and supporting the independence of countries that were colonies, those countries are going to be their allies in the Cold War struggle against communism. And conversely, the Soviets can sponsor independence movements in colonized countries and have more communist states in their struggle against the United States. So that's a big part of decolonization. Think of it in that Cold War context. All right. So independence movements, such as in India, India demanded self-rule, and that led to the rise of the independence movement in India, which created new states on the Indian subcontinent, namely India and Pakistan. All right, so India will be a democratic nation, and it will develop after the country gained independence. All right, so let's look at the regional setting for the independence movement. We are talking about the Indian subcontinent, that's British India, and has been a colony, the jewel in the British Empire, in the crown of the British Empire, since they basically won complete control of it from the French after the 7 Years' War. And so you have India. Eventually, there will be a partition when the British leave, and Pakistan will be formed, all right, as well as Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. Make sure you take note that Pakistan was formerly West Pakistan, Bangladesh was formerly East Pakistan, and Sri Lanka was formerly Ceylon. Okay. So the British ruled India. It was it was a British colony for almost 2 centuries, from the 1700s to the 1900s, with the East India Company. Indian resistance begins to intensify during World War II. All right, because Indians fought alongside their British allies in World War II, and their involvement sparked a nationalistic movement. There was a lot of pride and feelings of nationalism. And out of this emerged a leader named Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi launched a non-violent campaign of non-cooperation with the British. So he is not going to use violence. He's going to use non-violent direct action, protests, sit-ins, hunger strikes, marches, to basically campaign for Indian independence. It's very successful. So Gandhi becomes an important leader in India's independence movement. Non-violence and passive resistance are his key strategies, and civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is where you disobey a law because that law is unjust. All right, and so I think you might be able to think of somebody else who has done this. And if you're thinking Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., you're right, because nonviolent, passive resistance, and civil disobedience were key tenets of Dr. King's direct action approach during the American Civil Rights Movement. And so the Indian National Congress is formed. Indians struggled with the British and each other. They were trying to hash out a collective sort of organization to resist British rule. So there are two very prominent religious groups in India. Those are Hindus and Muslims. So the Indian National Congress forms the Congress Party. This is India's national political party, and most of them were Hindus, but a few of them were Muslims. So modern India, India today is the Republic of India. It is the world's largest democracy. So I want to say there's not quite 2 billion people, but maybe closer to maybe 1.3, 1.4 billion people. So this is a little bit off. Let's say 1.35 billion people. Huge number of people in India. They have some issues. They are divided along Hindu and Muslim lines, so there's some conflict there. They're constantly at odds with Pakistan, especially over there's a territory between the two called Kashmir that both have claim to, and so they periodically fight each other over that. All right, Indian subcontinent. Here's Pakistan. Okay, this was partitioned off. Um, and many Muslims went to Pakistan, Hindus to India. They still have some dispute over that Kashmiri territory. India is a very modern nation in the cities. If you go to India, the cities are almost like, the United States. The kids there are similar to kids in the United States in the things that they like and the technology that they use and the way they live their lives. But it's very different in the countryside. The rural areas don't have electricity and running water and things like that. It's a huge nation, lots of people, and so there's kind of a struggle to provide basic services to those very rural areas. So there's a big difference between the cities and the countryside in India. Don't forget that we talked a little bit about the Taj Mahal in a previous lecture. All right. Indian democracy under Jawaharlal Nehru, who was a close associate of Gandhi, flourished into a Western-style democracy with an industrialized economy. So their constitution sought to prohibit caste discrimination. Think back to World War I, that caste system that had evolved in India. That continued to be a problem in modern India, where there was discrimination based on those castes, and they still have a little bit of trouble with that today. But they wanted to do away with it as they modernize. There are ethnic and religious differences that have caused problems in the development of India as a democratic nation. I mentioned Hindus and Muslims, but you have all sorts of different ethnic groups living within those borders too, and so that's caused a little bit of strife. But their economy is doing quite well. The United States does a lot of business with India and exports a lot of service industry type stuff to India. And in fact, India has become a hub for software development. And so many software developers outsource that work to India. They have a lot of high-tech industry there. Okay, let's look at African independence. So the UN Charter guaranteed colonial populations the right to self-determination. Remember that term. And independence movements in Africa challenged European imperialism. The UN Charter gave Africa the right to self-determination, which they really, should have had a long time ago. So there were both peaceful and violent revolutions after World War II. We see a nationalistic kind of movement, a resurgence of African culture and heritage. You also see what's called Pan-Africanism, where there's a lot of support by African Americans and other peoples around the world who, celebrate African heritage and support African independence. There's a resentment of imperial rule and economic exploitation, and so the colonies of Great Britain, France, Belgium, and Portugal will be lost. And this is going to be supported, remember, by the United States and the Soviet Union. The US and the Soviet Union are pushing for these European countries to give up their colonies because they're vying for influence in the context of the Cold War. So some of these countries learn that they can sort of wag the dog, if you will. Tails wagging dogs is the saying. They learn that if they want support for independence, if they want, military equipment or money, all they need to do is lean toward communism or lean toward the West, and they can get support from one superpower or the other. So they're actually able to kind of, play the two against each other, kind of in a clever way. Examples of independence movements and subsequent efforts. So West Africa peacefully transitioned to self-determination, whereas we see some conflict, some wars for independence in places like Algeria. Right? Kenya had a violent struggle under the leadership of Kenyatta, all right, to win its independence. In South Africa, there was significant strife. South Africa had a system called apartheid, and apartheid was segregation, very strict segregation. If you ever watch The Daily Show, there's a comedian who hosts it, and his name is Trevor Noah. And Trevor Noah actually wrote an interesting book called Born a Crime, because I believe his father was white and his mother was black, and it was illegal for them to have a child together in South Africa under apartheid. That was actually illegal in the United States too. Until 1967, black people and white people were not allowed to get married in many southern states. Well, apartheid was a system of legal racial segregation that was strictly enforced by the National Party government in South Africa, and it went from 1948 all the way until 1994. The Clinton administration actually imposed sanctions, well, in previous administrations actually imposed sanctions against South Africa. And it's under the Clinton administration that those sanctions are lifted when apartheid finally ends. It's important to note that the majority of non-white inhabitants in South Africa were curtailed. So they were given fewer rights, they were discriminated against. The white inhabitants of South Africa were given better land. They were treated like, like the elite, whereas black South Africans were treated like second-class citizens. So under the leadership of Nelson Mandela, they fought for independence and an end to apartheid, and eventually struggled. Nelson Mandela ends up becoming the first black president of the Republic of South Africa, and becomes one of the world's greatest civil rights leaders, right up there with Gandhi and King. All right, let's look at the creation of Middle Eastern nations. So remember the mandate system, that thing that was established under the League of Nations, where France and Britain got all those mandates, like Syria, Palestine, and Jordan. Well, remember I told you those mandates are basically colonies. It's an unjust system that did not allow those Middle Eastern countries to have self-determination. So the mandate system after World War I was phased out after World War II. With the end of the mandates, new states were created in the Middle East. So this gave those old parts of the Ottoman Empire and the German Empire independence. These Middle Eastern countries are finally going to be able to govern themselves. Remember, the mandate system basically divided the Ottoman Empire among European powers and Germany. They said, hey, eventually we'll give areas like the Middle East their independence, but we need to govern them for now because they're not really, I'm going to draw quotes, able to govern themselves, right? Really, it was about resources. And mandates were basically colonies. It was an excuse. All right, so French mandates in the Middle East were Syria and Lebanon. All right, and they're going to get their independence. British mandates in the Middle East were Jordan, which was originally Transjordan, and Palestine, which will become part of the independent state of Israel. And there's still conflict, in that part of the world over Palestine, and calls for an independent Palestine separate from the state of Israel. And so we still see conflict as a result of the creation of the state of Israel after World War II. But many Palestinians who live in Israel and want their own separate sort of lands, whereas others believe that they should integrate those societies. And so there's just continual conflict in that part of the world. All right, Golda Meir was Prime Minister of Israel after initial setbacks. She led Israel to victory in the Yom Kippur War, sought support from the United States. Abdul Nasser was president of Egypt from 1956 to 1970. he nationalized the Suez Canal, which means that he took control of the Suez Canal, uh, from the Europeans and for the Egyptians. He established a relationship with the Soviet Union, and built the Aswan High Dam. And so you're going to end up with kind of a U.S.-backed Israel, Soviet-backed kind of Egypt, and we're going to see a lot of conflict between those two powers throughout the Cold War. Notably, the Six-Day War, where Israel defeated 6 Arab countries on 3 fronts in 6 days, or 9 Arab countries on 3 fronts in 6 days, I should say. So there's continued conflict in the Middle East throughout that time period. Let's look at important world organizations. So you've got the European Union. The EU is a political union in Europe consisting of many nations. And what they did was they formed this political union and then eased their border restrictions to facilitate trade between European states. So basically, like if you're you own a trucking company in Spain, it's easier for you to ship your goods to Poland. And so more trade means higher standard of living, means people are making more money and everybody's better off. And it worked because the euro, which is the dollar that they adopted under the EU, actually continues to be worth more than the dollar. And you can spend it anywhere in these nations, and it's more valuable than the dollar. I'm not sure what, as of this recording, hang on and I'll look it up. Let's see, dollar value of euro. I'm Googling it on my phone. All right. And I will tell you in just a moment. So right now on, what's today? August 4th, 2020, 1 euro is worth $1.18. So the euro is a very strong currency because of this European Union that they formed. All right. We also have the United Nations, which we've talked about. Its mission is to prevent and solve conflicts all over the world. It has all sorts of organizations within it. It has the International Monetary Fund. This gives loans to developing nations. It helps build bridges and build industry in developing nations in order to help them improve. So the IMF is really important. You also have in the UN, you have UNESCO that helps provide humanitarian supplies. You have the World Food Program that provides food. You have the World Health Organization that's part of the UN that helps provide medical care. So the UN is a very important world organization that helps solve all sorts of humanitarian problems all over the planet. Cool stuff. All right. You have the EU, which I talked about. It has trade benefits, economic and political. It's an economic and political union. Remember, the euro is that currency that's used throughout the European Union. You have the United Nations to prevent and solve conflicts. You have the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, to give loans to developing nations to build roads and bridges and industry. You also have the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization promotes free trade and trade agreements between countries. So golden rule in economics, guys. Trade makes everyone better off. Trade raises the standard of living. It's always, if you can buy it cheaper than you can build it, then you should buy it, and that's the nature of trade. Okay. You also have NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is a $1.7 trillion benefit for the U.S. economy. This is a trade agreement between us, the United States, and Mexico, and it basically eases trade restrictions and creates this CAN-MEX corridor in which tremendous volume of trade is done between our 3 countries. And so we make a lot of money off of NAFTA. You have the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, formed during the Cold War as a military alliance against the Warsaw Pact, continues to be a relevant organization today. Here's a little trivia question, when is the last time, so according to the NATO alliance, if one member of NATO is attacked, the other members of NATO have to come to that member's defense. When is the last time the Mutual Defense Agreement in NATO was activated? 9/11. When the 9/11 terror attacks occurred, our NATO allies had to send us military assistance in our war on terrorism. Let's look at some important people in the 20th century. Margaret Thatcher was a British prime minister. Remember, that's like their president. And she established free trade and less government regulation of business. She had a very close relationship with the United States and U.S. foreign policy. And she asserted the United Kingdom's military power, Margaret Thatcher. Indira Gandhi had basically built a closer relationship between India and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Essentially, what she was trying to do was unmoor India and prevent India from becoming, basically a proxy of either the United States or the Soviet Union. But she became kind of friendlier with the Soviets, and she developed a nuclear program in India. Mikhail Gorbachev, we've already talked about. Nobel Peace Prize winner, leader of the Soviet Union, willing to let communism fail, refused to keep communism intact by force, introduced glasnost or openness, listen to the Soviet people, and perestroika, which means restructuring. Hey, let's restructure our economy, let's reform it and allow free market practices if that's what works. He let the Berlin Wall fall. He was the last leader of the Soviet Union because now it is called the Russian Federation. All right. And he oversaw a peaceful transition to democracy, Mikhail Gorbachev. Deng Xiaoping is going to do some similar things in China. So he's going to reform the communist economy in China to a market economy. He's going to embrace capitalism in China. Guess what? China, the most populous nation on earth, is going to undergo rapid economic growth when it embraces capitalism. So the economy in China is not communist. The government is controlled by the Communist Party, but the economy is not communist. So China is not really technically communist, technically speaking. They sort of have a weird sort of blend of command economics and free market capitalism, mostly free market capitalism, but they're definitely not a communist state in the true sense of the word. Let's look at some conflicts in the world today. So we have developed and developing nations. So a developed nation is like the United States. You have developing nations that are industrializing. You have least developed nations, and these are countries that have just started to industrialize. They face a lot of challenge. Migrations, like refugees. You have ethnic and religious conflicts around the world. You have new technologies that are having an impact. Let's take a look. So you have migrations. Many people choose to migrate because they see a chance for a better opportunity. So refugees are typically people who migrate because they are forced to migrate because of poverty, war, natural disaster, or persecution. Many countries do not welcome immigrants because they take away jobs and services for natural born citizens and can create hostility and discrimination. Right? So a lot of countries look at immigration as a problem. Right? The United States actually sort of has made immigration into a success story. And the United States continues to resettle more refugees than any other country in the world. And our success as a nation is really built on immigration. You have guest workers, who are people that live in one country but work in another. This is common in European cities. You also have a lot of guest workers in the Middle East because oil-based economies tend to have labor shortages. So guest workers come to a country for work. That could be legal or illegal, and it's a common thing. Since 1945, Europe has been a destination for immigration to make up for the loss of its labor force. They lost a lot of, military-age males in World War I and World War II. So they've had a lot of immigration as a result. You have ethnic and religious conflicts. So in the Middle East, you have the Shiite-Sunni divide. So Shiite Muslims believe that the leader of Islam has to be somebody that is a blood descendant of their prophet, Muhammad, whereas Sunnis believe it can be any qualified person. Now, this was not always like a really major conflict. In fact, for most of history, it hasn't been. It's been exacerbated in recent years because you have a predominantly Shiite Iran who is vying for control of the Middle East with a predominantly Sunni, Saudi Arabia. And so this divide has been kind of blown up because of that. So just two branches of the same religion. And you can kind of look back. We've seen this with in Christianity with Protestantism and Catholicism. So it's not unusual to have these kind of metaphysical sort of disagreements. You have Arab versus American conflicts. There's ongoing conflict in the Middle East that has been going on for some time. We've had the wars in Iraq, Operation Iraqi Freedom. We have war in Afghanistan, Operation Enduring Freedom, that went on for quite some time. The Middle East is a source of vast oil resources and major strategic waterways. And so people are going to continue to vie for influence there for years to come. You have the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. In 1948, the state of Israel was created, but there are Palestinians that live there too. And these groups, along with Christians, have holy sites in the city of Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is a holy city to Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And so what you have is people there that are perfectly content to have Jewish and Christian and Muslim neighbors, and you have people there that are not. And that's been a source of some conflict. The rest of the Arab world, there are leaders in the Middle East that would like to see Israel go away. Some are, friendlier to Israel than others. And this has been a source of conflict since Israel was created. So ethnic, religious, and religious conflicts have also occurred in Europe, particularly Northern Ireland. You have Catholics versus Protestants fighting it out there. In 1922, Ireland won independence from Great Britain. All right, and so there were basically 6 areas in the north that had a Protestant background and remained part of Great Britain, and that's Northern Ireland. And in Northern Ireland, Catholics faced discrimination. So Protestants in the north continually sort of pushed back against Catholic demands for civil rights. Also, Catholics in Northern Ireland wanted to unify with the rest of Ireland. In the 1960s, Catholic and Protestant extremists turned to violence. And what you're going to get is a period known as the Troubles. And the Troubles was basically where you have Irish separatist groups, namely the Irish Republican Army, who used terrorism, mainly in the form of improvised explosive devices to sort of target Protestants and target UK military forces in an effort to win sort of independence for Northern Ireland. They signed the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. There was a peace accord and began to establish a power-sharing government. In 2009, though, the IRA rose up again, and we saw continued violence, though for a short period of time. I mentioned this during our World War I lecture, but we start and finish the 20th century with violence in the Balkans. You have a number of ethnic groups in the Balkans. You have long-standing ethnic hatred in the Balkans, and so as a result of that, you have a lot of strife. So if you remember, Princeps assassinating Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo, World War I in the Balkans, by the time we get to the end of the 20th century, we're right back there in Bosnia and Kosovo fighting again. So Yugoslavia sort of tied all of these countries together under a leader named Marshal Tito, who ruled with a blood-soaked fist. So they didn't have a choice but to live under one rule. Once communism fell, Yugoslavia broke apart into Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, Macedonia, Serbia, and Kosovo. There's going to be a lot of conflict amongst these groups. Especially you're going to see Serbs, um, trying to carve out their own ethnic state. You're going to see ethnic cleansing and genocide, and so conflict in the Balkans at the end of the 20th century. In the Horn of Africa, Rwanda will face one of Africa's deadliest wars. Um, Back when Rwanda was a colony, all right, the Tutsis, because they were lighter skinned, were put in charge. They were the ethnic minority, but they were lighter skinned than the Hutu majority. So they became the sort of intermediaries who were in charge, right? They were part of East German, German East Africa, passed on to the Belgians later on, and eventually they win their independence. So what ends up happening is there's a famine in Rwanda. People are starving, and land is scarce, and there are deep hatreds between the Hutus and the Tutsis. They really don't like each other, and because of the famine and the lack of availability of land, the Hutus start to try to wipe out the Tutsis and take their land, take their farmland. And it turns into a genocide. And in Rwanda, in the course of about 100 days, an estimated 1 million Tutsis and Hutus who are Tutsi sympathizers are killed. And so that's the Rwanda genocide, very bloody episode. Very similar conflicts occurred in Burundi, as did in Rwanda. Sudan gains its independence from the Arab-led government and enacted laws and policies that discriminated non-Muslims and other ethnic groups. And since then, Sudan has had a civil war, and South Sudan has split from Sudan. And in Darfur, which is in South Sudan, you have Arabic Sudanese who are basically murdering black Muslims and Christians in South Sudan. So there's some bad stuff going on there. In South Asia, you have Hinduism versus Buddhism in Sri Lanka, which has resulted in the Buddhist majority sort of leading a bloody civil war. And the truce kind of eases the violence in the early 2000s. New technology has changed our world significantly. You can't really overstate that, right? Widespread but unequal access to computers and instantaneous communications has really pushed that. Remember that term globalization that I told you guys about? Well, instantaneous communication and computer technology has really furthered globalization, and we really live in a very small global community these days, though it's not equitable. And some people have better access than others, even within the United States. And you guys are probably aware of that, because where we live, we don't really have equal access to internet compared to other places. So you might live in a place in the county where you don't have internet access, which puts you at a disadvantage. You also have some schools in cities, so for example, at our school, we have a computer for every student. There are schools that only have a computer for every 50 or 60 students. So, and this is not just a US phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon. So less developed countries are behind when it comes to, equitable access to communications and computers, things like that. We have seen advances in genetic engineering, which has raised some very serious bioethics questions. The completion of the Human Genome Project, the mapping of the human genome, has led to major breakthroughs in our understanding of genetics, and has also brought up some serious questions. So you can manipulate genetic material to produce specific results, but theoretically, scientists say that you can breed out disease. So essentially, people can selectively choose, embryos that don't contain genetic markers for certain types of cancer and certain hereditary illnesses. But it's a slippery slope, because other scientists say that, hey, this is only a short, leap from choosing physical features like eye color and height, and things like that. So there's some serious bioethical questions raised about genetic science. Stem cell research has raised many ethical questions about the role of science in creating and changing life, for the very reasons that I've listed here. So developed and developing nations are characterized by different levels of economic development, population characteristics, and social conditions. So let's look at the contrasts between developed and developing nations. You can actually separate that into developed, developing, and least developed nations. You can divide them into three categories. Developed versus developing. So geographic locations of major developed and developing countries. It usually depends on where a country is located as to whether it'll be prosperous or not. So if you're landlocked, you don't have access to ports, you're not as likely to be as prosperous. Water access is important. Economic conditions are important. Social conditions such as literacy, who can read, and access to quality healthcare are important. And population size and rate of growth are important. What you'll find is that developed nations have reached a slower rate of growth than developing nations. Developing nations tend to have rapid population growth. Take a look at this map. And what you see is that the advanced economies of the world are in the global north, and many of the developing countries are in the global south, okay, with the exception of Australia. All right, and then of course, Japan is still technically there. Now, there used to be a theory called environmental determinism in which geographers argued wrongly that, the societies of the global north are just intellectually superior than the societies of the global south. All right, and that's why that's why we see this dynamic. What it really comes down to, let me get my eraser here, is a handful of things. Eraser, there we go, because it's getting a little busy. Essentially what you run into is you get the development of key technologies in places like the Middle East and in China that diffuse, but it's in Europe and around the Fertile Crescent and areas like that, but especially in Europe where you have useful domesticatable animals like cows, pigs, goats, sheep, and horses, and you have high yield grain crops. So if you have high yield grain crops and useful domesticatable animals, more people can engage in other practices, and fewer people can farm. So you can have fewer farmers and more people specializing in other things. So for example, if you go down to Papua New Guinea, they don't have high yield grain crops. They have taro, which is very, very arduous to cultivate. So it basically required everybody in a village to harvest taro, and they're basically burning as many calories as they're producing. Whereas like a wheat farm can feed lots of people, which means those people that aren't wheat farming can go do other things. And if you look, you can export those crops, to similar climates, east and west, and that allows for large sedentary populations. That allows for agricultural revolutions and industrialization. And essentially, these global north locations had the tools, kind of by luck of the draw, at their disposal to imperialize Africa, Asia, and Latin America. All right, and so then you enter into a period of imperialism, of colonization, of economic and military imperialism, and decolonization. And so what you're seeing is that these countries are now coming out of that period and kind of coming into their own. And in fact, right now, the fastest growing middle class in the world is in Africa. Fastest growing middle class in the world. Tremendous amounts of natural resources. All right, so if you want to know more about environmental possibilism, there's a great book called Guns, Germs, and Steel by a geographer named Jared Diamond, who really does a good job of explaining it, because it's brought up some still in 2020 We hear kind of racist ideologies that, Europeans are somehow superior, and that's not really the case. It was luck of the draw that they had those high yield grain crops, useful domesticatable animals, exposure to the diseases that are carried by, domesticatable animals that, obviously Latin America did not have. Well, anyway, I digress. So the economic development and the population growth, the economic development and the rapid growth of the population are having an impact on the environment. Factors that affect the environment: economic development, rapid population growth. We see more rapid population growth in developing nations because essentially population growth is on a curve. So like over time, you know, basically what you get is sort of steep population growth, but as a society becomes more developed, family size becomes smaller. Part of that is that you have, in more developing nations, you have more women's rights. So women are more likely to have fewer children. They're more likely to have children later in life. So family sizes tend to be smaller as both men and women are more career oriented. And so like in the United States, the average sort of number of children per household is 2.1. In like, I think in like Japan and Norway, it's like 1.3 or 1.7 or something. So they're actually in slight decline. The United States has tapered off. But then what you have are, developing nations are much earlier in the curve. So like they're where the United States was when it was industrializing. During America's industrial period, we had a rapid population growth because even though people were living longer and more children were surviving childbirth, old habits die hard and families were still big. So some environmental challenges include pollution, loss of habitat, global climate change. So developing nations face a number of challenges. Let me go back to this. So we mentioned pollution, loss of habitat. Climate change is recognized as one of the major sort of challenges that our species faces. We did sign the Kyoto Protocol. We've withdrawn from it, but most developed nations in the world have committed themselves to fighting climate change because we are aware, climate science tells us that we're sort of on the precipice. If we don't start taking action now, we could drastically affect our climate and therefore the ecology. Okay, so developed and developing nations face a number of challenges. These include migrations, ethnic and religious conflicts, and the impact of new technologies. There's a lot of social challenges, such as poverty, poor health, illiteracy, famine, migration, refugees are part of that, all right? Countries of the world are increasingly dependent on each other for raw materials, for markets, for financial resources. There's still a difference, though, between developed and developing nations. All right, this is that globalization process. The world has been shrinking since, the 16th century, late 15th, 16th century. The world has been steadily shrinking, and we're still in that process. How is economic interdependence changing the world today? What do you guys think? What is interdependence? It means that nations of the world depend on one another for just about everything. Rapid transportation, communication, and computer networks have resulted in, many trade linkages. So much so that pretty much anything that you use is made in more than one country. Even the shirt on your back is made in multiple countries. Your cell phone is made in a bunch of different countries. Your cars, even domestic cars, supposedly have parts from all over the world. So, we depend on each other for a lot of things. There are multinational corporations, as in corporations that are based out of many nations. International boundaries are starting to become more permeable as trade linkages increase, as people migrate more. as regions integrate. So, for example, the European Union is a really good example of that. We have our own, the North American Free Trade Agreement between us and Canada and Mexico, and of course the World Trade Organization that seeks to facilitate those linkages. You have international organizations like the UN that seek to resolve conflict and promote, world health and fight world hunger. You have the International Monetary Fund that lends money to countries for various things like roads and bridges and railroads, seeks to help them build their economies. Terrorism has become a major problem in the 21st century, and it's been a problem for a long time, but it's especially prominent after 9/11. Both developed and developing nations of the world have problems that are brought about by inequities in their social systems, in their culture, in their economy. And some people choose to deal with these inequities with the use of terrorist activities. All right. Terrorism is the use of violence and threats to intimidate and coerce for political reasons. One major cause is religious extremism. So you have Al Qaeda, who is a terrorist organization who launched attacks against the United States, flew planes into the World Trade Center, flew a plane into the Pentagon. One plane went down in a field in Pennsylvania, and what was a kind of a watershed moment for the 21st century. Really, September 11th, 2001 really sort of changed the U.S. Foreign policy, changed its military, changed the national psyche in very fundamental ways. And we engaged in two major wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We are still kind of embroiled in this global war on terrorism. We have a different view of sort of non-state actors as the really most preeminent threats, and so we're only starting to pivot away from that in recent years. Examples of international terrorism include the Munich Olympics. So Palestinian terrorists held Israeli athletes hostage in the 1970s Summer Olympics. They were all killed in a botched raid. Terrorist attacks in the United States in 2001. This was motivated by extremism. This is under Osama bin Laden. Car bombings, suicide bombers, airline hijackings. This one right here, I'm particularly familiar with, and I will share with you guys in a subsequent video. Roadside bombs, IEDs, are a major means of terrorism, and that's what I've spent a lot of time working to counter as a specialized search dog handler. Our job was to search out these IEDs, using dogs off leash, going down the road to find these roadside bombs. And I have some, videos and pictures that I can show you guys. Nothing scary, just to give you an idea of, how they work and what it was all about. Okay. All right. How do we react to it? Well, the government response to terrorist activities has been increased surveillance. All right. And a review of privacy rights. All right. The Patriot Act is a little bit controversial because it gave the government additional abilities to conduct surveillance on U.S. citizens suspected of terrorism, but we've also found out that it's been abused a little bit. There was a sort of whistleblower named Edward Snowden who sort of exposed that there was some NSA spying going on, and they were surveilling some people they shouldn't have. So questions have been raised about privacy. Increased security at ports and airports. Before 9/11, all of this airport security really did not exist. You could definitely get on a plane faster. Now we're starting to, technology is sort of helping to speed things up a little bit, although there's still a lot of security. All right, so the Patriot Act. Legislation passed that allowed the U.S. government to basically conduct anti-terrorism surveillance on U.S. citizens. This is types of surveillance that used to be done exclusively on foreign adversaries that the NSA and Homeland Security can now do on somebody that has ties to terrorism. So it prevents terrorist activities in the United States, but it raises very serious concerns about privacy. All right, well, this concludes our SWL 14 through 16 lecture on the modern era. And make sure you guys do the discussion board, answer the chapter questions, and make sure you fill out those guided notes.